Good afternoon. Welcome to our afternoon section. Today, hopefully, you've used your lunch break well and have replenished your energy. And please follow us with hashtag Madrid Platform. You can make queries if you want. Let's move on to our next topic, water. Necessary changes to face up to climate change and water management. For that, we have today with us Fernando Bernard, partner of Cuatro Casas, Carlos Cosin, CEO of Alma Water and chair of the International Desalination Association, Gonzalo de la Cámara, from IMDEA Water, and later on, Aziza Ahmoud will be joining us. She's the head of the OECD Water Governance Program, and also Luis Torres, head of business of the French company Finex. Thank you for your kind words of introduction. I'd first like to thank Madrid Platform and more specifically Carlos Morales for the good job. And also, I would like to thank the mayor and deputy mayor of Madrid, who have also done a great job. Hopefully, this will be not a one-off, but one of many future such events. Now, to start our debate, let's look back and take stock of what the water sector has been dealing with in the last 15 years, because things evolve, but we also have to deal with several things which we will be looking into during our session. The UN, only a few years ago, started the 2030 horizon with a series of goals which were well received by our water industry, because for the first time ever, we had our own horizon, our specific horizon within the general sustainability goals and topics. Moreover, the idea was to boost the fight against climate change with water as an important axis in these endeavors. So, on the one hand, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, more concretely number 6, water and sanitation, and from there on, other developments within the 17 targets need progress in our sector, because you can't eradicate poverty or be sustainable in ecological terms if you don't properly manage water as a resource. Furthermore, the climate change has showcased to what extent floodings and droughts have become ever more acute. Thus, we need to be able to properly steward and protect the scarce resource, water. So, in doing this analysis, I was wondering how we can combine this with what we've been doing in recent years in the field of renewable energy. 2017, 2018, at long last, we saw tariffs that dealt with the topic of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, because up to then I had been quite concerned in view of the stagnation of the Kyoto Protocol goals. I realized that at the end of the day, we needed competitive tariffs on fees on the market, and it was just about fossil fuels. So hydrogen, for example, has become a very interesting avenue to explore. But when we, in 2017, 2018, we saw fees of $2 or $3 things were quite shaken up. We know that up to 50% of production on transportation costs falls to energy. Green, zero-emission energy makes a difference. I'm convinced that the cost of the resort to green energies has to be factored in, even if that is not so today. So let's look at our advances and progress during the last 15 years. Well, we're facing a stark reality. Why can't we progress as we would like to? Well, there are hurdles, regulatory hurdles, and there are obstacles in various fields of responsibility at a central and regional administration level, for example. And I don't want to speak only about the situation in Spain, because things are quite similar also in other countries, as we will see. But there is an issue that nobody says no to. So everyone does coincide in the fact that water is important and needs to be protected. And we are in the first level of development and can develop technologies to produce water, new resources, and to transport it in a more or less efficient way. And we have cutting-edge technologies. In some countries, they've been used and they are in production. So if there is no upfront, clear, negative reaction on the part of population or the administration, we now face a situation where we're looking for a niche to invest. We get that echo from the finance or funding agencies and banks. Truth is that there are budgetary constraints, but at the end of the day, the funding is available. So I would like to just showcase that we are lacking political will. The political will needs to go hand in hand with an awareness in the population, with a change in behavior patterns, so that this trickles up to the level of political decision-making. So there's been some progress as and when, but there are countries where 15, 20 years ago a decision was taken to include as a priority on the political agenda with water, like in Singapore or Australia or Saudi Arabia, and others are following suit now. But these countries planned properly and implemented, and now they're reaping the benefits. Now they are very well positioned in order to be able to compete in the future in the development of their most competitive markets. They are able to extract an extra added value to the agricultural produce, for example, something other countries that lag behind cannot do. So, are we aware that this needs to be done, this is a step that needs to be taken, and that we, the citizens, need to nudge our politicians in that direction, and that at the end of the day, it is an issue of wanting to plan and to deploy. So that's the framework. My colleagues will be shedding light on other aspects, and Fernando, I'll leave you to your 10 minutes presentation so that the others may chip in later on. Thank you. Well, water. I do deal with the word of finance and financing of infrastructure, and that's where I have my interface with the element water. So, circling back to what you said, sustainability is now part of the mainstream political discourse, and sustainability is mainly related to renewable energy, PV, wind, water, if you want. But water in general is not a topic. Water has been part of our life forever. The renewables are a novelty, and that is why water has been a bit sidelined. Maybe because water is an element that has been ever present in many structures that we know from very old times. And thus, since it has been with us forever, the administrative structures have grown quite complex and are a bit difficult to deal with today. But if you don't achieve a real public support that will allow for a reasonable mitigation of the associated risks when dealing with water, it's difficult to foresee progress with water beyond what is the public realm. And if you add sustainability as the most basic element, the picture becomes complete. Water is left to the strictly public field. You have investors and financial agencies that would be able to provide an input of funding, like in renewable energies, for example, totally equivalent, but that money simply doesn't come through because we have these issues with who is responsible, who is competent, and who does what at what administrative level. So water from outside the system, well, for example, desalination is an alternative, but many people don't see it that way. Many countries have tourism as a very important source of income and other related fields, and they still don't realize the importance of desalination, and not as a one-off project, but as a more comprehensive, transverse way of looking at things. So these projects need to be structured. You pay for availability. There are minimum risks that need to be mitigated, like, for example, no power outages. So you need to pay for availability, and you cannot shoulder the users in general with these responsibilities. You need land use permits, the timelines need to be defined, and so on and so forth. So any financer that embarks on a long-term project needs to see these risks mitigated to a minimum extent, and that demands a lot of coordination at the various competent administrative levels, and then there is the legislative power and structure that is still insufficient, in my view. There are countries, Algeria, for example, or Morocco, and others that you have already named here, that have been able to take this step and move forward. So I do very much look forward to have water as part of the sustainability effort. There is still a lot to do. And I do think really the responsibility lies within the public administration. They have to say what's what. Well, I really do think that we are thinking along the same line. Gonzalo, thank you very much for inviting me. In August 2019, the New York Times had a headline, full page, with the World Resources Institute, a think tank, that said that 25% of the world population by 2040 would be submitted to water stress. And actually, if you look at the map of the 17 countries that were prioritized in terms of water stress, many are in MENA that shares a lot of geographical traits with us here, and also with the countries at the Pacific coast of Peru, for example, the north of Chile, north of Argentina, or the north east of Brazil, for example. So, in the press conference, Andrew Steer, the CEO of the World Resources Institute, at the time said, the water crisis is the most severest crisis and the crisis we pay less attention to. So, what's the challenge? We need to understand that new public goods are coming up that nobody is paying for. We haven't had a mature, grown-up debate in society, our society and the society of others who are joining us today, that needs to deal with risk management. We have also the issue of governance. We will be listening later on to Aziza Ahmouch, one of the people who have most fostered and boosted these issues. So, when we talk about risk, we need to ask ourselves if recovery of costs in water services is something ancillary, because at the end of the day, that is what is going to give us the necessary financial breathing space. We need to recover costs when managing the resource or when providing water services, because that in turn is going to allow us to guarantee some of these new public goods. For example, water assurance in the medium or long term. For example, people who are listening to us, a company that produces electrical hydroturbines, for example, or some farmer who needs to irrigate the fields. But we demand certain levels of payback of income in various industrial activities. So we do need to stop thinking of water as something strictly environmental or only with a bias referring to given industry, but we need to see this against the backdrop of macroeconomy, social and territorial cohesion, security and safety, public health, that is so important in times of pandemic. So if we're not able to link up these two parts of the equation, we'll not be able to see the full picture. And we need to be aware of who pays for what and who's going to be paying for something that apparently nobody pays for. Because at the end of the day, if nobody pays for security, at the end of the day, we will be paying for the lack of security. For example, assuring the supply of water. We've concentrated on resource management and capital models and methodology in order to mitigate uncertainty. Now, after the advent of COVID, we've realized that uncertainty is here to stay, and we need to embrace that, to accept complexity and to accept that we can't oversimplify, because that is not going to lead us anywhere good. So there's ever more uncertainty, and therefore in the water industry we need to reflect on integrated visions. Water needs to go hand in hand with energy, for example, and you can't separate energy from water. And digitalization is necessarily part and parcel, because data centers do consume humongous amounts of energy, and water is necessary for that. So we need to be like in the circus, playing around with many balls at once. It's like if the, for example, the head of the Christianity started not to say Mass, for example, the Pope. So that's totally unthinkable. So, in some situations, there may be a deficit of political will, but there is a lucky alignment of certain stars and planets. And why is that? Because we realize that we need to increase our resilience, become more efficient. In some parts of the planet, we have enormous, unprecedented fiscal stimuli program. Next Generation in the EU, the plan launched by Biden, also in China and in South Korea. There are programs in Australia too. So it's a lot of fiscal effort that is reshaping the public sector that had problems due to fiscal consolidation issues and had retreated from funding in this industry. And the private sector also needs to rethink and redefine. In the 21st century, we necessarily have to think also in social terms. And society is changing too. Let's think of Latin America, of the main metropolitan areas there. We have huge concentrations of population in Buenos Aires, Lima, Santiago, Sao Paulo, Bogota. And think of the social situation there. Social upheavals in Colombia, social upheavals that have led to a constitutional reform in Chile. We've also a constitutional and political crisis in Peru that has been unprecedented, lots of instability. And in the province of Buenos Aires, the company services more than 10 million people. About 60 or 70% of the income it gets lost because the billing process isn't good enough. So we do need to align with collective and social goals in our corporate demeanor. For example, look at Chennai in India or in Cape Town, where there might be even supply outages. And Lima in Peru is not so far removed from this situation. And in Brazil, with that huge country with an enormous economic potential, has been affected not only due to the macroeconomic and social and corruption crisis, but also due to a drought that has affected Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo. I'll leave it at that, and maybe I'll chip in later on. I wanted to talk about the way we don't really value water. I would say that only when countries have realized that lack of water is a fact, a reality they have to deal with, and it's only when you don't have something that you cherish it. But precisely the countries that have stepped up their efforts and are better positioned now have done so for lack of this resource. It's a matter of security. And we, in our countries that haven't realized that yet, we don't see the problem because obviously we have tap water that freely flows. But but in the Nile, for example, well, I won't say what river is the largest and most important river, whether the Amazon River or Nile River, but they have an ecology problem in the Nile Basin due to the dam that is being built by Sudan, and the agricultural use of water that could be perfectly well solved through reuse of water is simply forgotten and sidelined until at the end of the day we have to trigger the emergency brakes. Let's look at Israel. 20 years ago, they decided that irrigation water needed to be reused, 85%. 4% on average worldwide is reused, and the industrial water is also reused up to 80%. And that comes at a price, but people are willing to pay it because they realize the value of what they're paying for. So water has an infinite value. It is a right people are entitled to, but then you need to be able to pay for it. And that is a debate that still has to be fully developed. Absolutely right. Macroeconomic trends in sub-Saharan Africa. I only recently read about this boom in digitalization. That is a shortcut for these countries to reach development. And I read that the agricultural efficiency rate is only, let's say, 12 or 15% of the efficiency rate in the European Union. So I was wondering to what extent, to what percentage that deficit is attributable to the lack of reuse or availability of water resources. And water has to do with migration at the end of the day. When we speak about volatility and uncertainty, that is maybe one of the main key elements to bear in mind. And we need to realize that water is key. If you don't have water, you are totally empty-handed. If you have water, you may lack things, but you at least have water. We're living at a standard and in a situation we hadn't seen since the Second World War, with this fiscal expansion, with the advent of new technologies and new elements that come into the equation, with unprecedented migration streams that are affecting profoundly everyone's life. This digitalization process, we need to harness this opportunity. It is a very small window, limited in time. The effect of these fiscal policies and public budgeting needs to be paid for by generations into the future. They will have to foot the bill. And we need to take this opportunity that is due to, unfortunately, to the COVID pandemic. And this has caught us off guard. And this is what comes to mind. We need to make use of this window, invest much more in technology. We need public support for the development of new, pure, 100% green technologies. We do need to give regulatory support, Because before you were talking about the structure of costs, and that when you open the tap and run water, you don't know what water really costs. Compare that to the electricity bill, which is absolutely it is so complicated that you don't understand it, with lots of clauses and bits and pieces of information due to the underlying administrative and legislative complexity. So I do agree with what you say, and let me just insist again on the fact that countries like Morocco or Algeria did what they had to do when faced with stark needs, like Ghana, for example.
Otherwise, it will be very difficult for water to get into the investment policies within the private sector. Yes, there is a lesson that we can draw from the pandemic that I think that it's still not being digested by the relevant parties. We need to find supranational solutions, and as Fernando was saying, we find ourselves in the water sector of atomization of the situation. And if we talk about what we were talking about before, Argentina, Peru, we see that there are important level of fragmentation. Spain is the same case, where there are municipal powers. I'm not saying I disagree with that, but I'm saying that when we have complex governance system, what we need to do is improving coordination systems within the water sector, the coordination of territorial policies, but we need to be able to coordinate our investment systems as well. So who's responsible for what, and what part do we ask the citizens to bear, bearing in mind equality factors, of course, but what costs do we do we ask citizens to bear? So in the end, it is a very opaque and dark sector, because they don't see the infrastructures, because they don't know how the resources, because we live under the fiction that water comes out from the tap and goes through the toilet, when it is not the case. There are some similarities with the energy sector. Indeed, they are network industries, and there are some similarities from the regulatory standpoint, but there aren't as many. But one that I do think is essential is understanding then, in the face of a common challenge, in this case, security, energy or water security, in a context of adaptation and mitigation of the effects of climate change, needs something like my colleague was saying. We are still not working on a linear system where we took the water from the medium, we alter its quality, and we return it to the medium so that it can treat it. When there are technologies and advanced treatments that would allow us, in a circular economy model, reclaim the water and use it again. And Spain, which is the country that has more reclaimed water in the EU, is still very, very far from depleting all its potential. And it's far because the incentive system is not well decided. If a farmer in any basin in the Mediterranean, either in France, in Italy, or in Spain, or Cyprus, or Greece, if someone has the opportunity to extract water from the means, and this means 20 cents per dollar by cubic meter, and for paying, and if they have to pay 50 or 60 cents for reclaimed water, there's no way. We have the capacity, we do have the technology, but we haven't generated the demand, or the demand is somehow trapped because we haven't found incentives. So the private sector needs to lead these changes, connect our productive models in a way that you will find the person that will buy your exceeding nutrients or resources that you need. And we have many interesting models in Latin America. For example, in La Farfana, in Santiago de Chile, treats water, is a self-sufficient water from an energy point of view, because it recovers, it reclaims biogas, and has a contract with the gas company, and provide this exceeding gas that they produce. We know this exists, but it seems like we have a problem trying to put all the pieces together. Well, but the thing is that we do know, we have a clear picture of where the problems are. We all know that if we use water from the water resources, we will deplete them, and we will then include saline channels, and we will alter them as well. Why? Because it's allowed. So we have a clear picture of what's going on. But since it's a complex phenomenon, then we will leave that for the next administration. And that happens in Spain and in Latin America. Or don't you think that in Chile, people aren't aware, just to set an example, that mining is a strategic sector and that the water problem is not yet resolved, that they decided that in the mountains, they don't need to bring water for the mining of copper and other materials. Are they willing to pay $7 or $8? And then they are indeed willing to pay $7 or $8 for a cubic meter. And there are many developers trying, but it's a very complex problem. I think that until we see that water is a constraining factor, in the past, you had to synthesize a protein, and you needed specific amino acids to get that done. But here, until economists don't realize that water will be the critical and constraining factor for mining in Lima, agriculture in Morocco, or in Spain, or in any other country, tourism in Greece, Egypt, we won't solve that problem that we are facing. But now, we have a window for opportunity, because this will last 5 or 10 years, not more than that. If we don't solve it now, the problem will remain. And yes, we need to invest in technology as well. And going back to COVID, how the pharmaceutical sector resolved an issue that no one thought a year and a half ago that we would come and have a vaccine, and we do have it. The pharmaceutical sector has invested $120 billion in innovation every year. I've read the companies that have invested the most. The water sector, if you include in the sector 25 and invests 600 billion, it's not even 0.003%. So we are not able to, if we're not able to generate attraction, people won't invest. Again, less than 0.1%. So if there were endemic problems within the water sector, I wouldn't bet on us solving the problems, because we don't have investors. We would need the public sector to assist us. Well, the person who invited the vaccine knew the price for getting there first. And this is, how the same way in which things work. We need to generate incentives, and this means, in the case of water, incentivizing farmers, but also producers, the transport companies, the distribution companies. In the end, there's some sort of public silence, and since this is a complex problem, administrations are reluctant to do something. Personally, I've had the privilege to take part in funding for projects on legal systems that, as a whole, did not offer the legal infrastructure for its development, but thanks to political and public will that was determined and used the agents that were relevant for those projects, all of this allowed launching projects that were critical to in the social dimension for the areas where these projects were located. So it's not just the developed countries who can introduce water in their agendas. Everyone can. And to give you some figures, to point out something, to point out this need that we need, this need to go beyond our borders. If we think about Spain, in the year 1959, when the law for the stabilization of economy was passed within the Spanish dictatorship, and there was a certain opponent, the agricultural sector represented 15% of the GDP and generated 25% of jobs in Spain. Spain was a country, and still is, a rural country with an important presence of agriculture in job creation. Right now, in 2019, before the COVID, it was 2.3% of the GDP and twice as much in job creation. And we can double these figures in several regions. But water was responsible of water was used to a 70% level, despite the great effort of upgrading the irrigation systems. And now let's go to Latin America. In the case of the Chilean economy, 90% of their exports go to 5 areas: copper, salmon, wine, farm produce, and everything that has to do with forestry, paper, timber, etc. 90%. What do these assets have in common? They're all intensive in terms of water. So if one of them risks the access to water, they risk not only the rest of the sector, but the population. If we go to Peru, in the Peruvian Pacific coast, it's like the southeastern region of Spain. Here we have 2/3 of the population. 50% of the GDP is generated in Lima alone, and we do this with 50% of the water resources in the country. We're talking about subjects that have to do with the core of the economic development of this country. And we're talking about what Carlos was saying is terrifying in terms of innovation. Spain is the 4th economy in the EU, and is one of the 5 countries of the 27 member states that invests in R&D the least with regard to the GDP. So we need to think about this. In the pandemic, we've discovered that we had a healthcare system that was somewhat reasonable, that we had a primary care system that is a little bit worse than we thought, and that we had terrible problems with virology, epidemiology, research in public health. This is something that we just discovered. We thought that we had the best healthcare system in the world, and I still think it's the case. It's one of the best, and it has universal coverage. But we've discovered that we had challenges ahead, and the same will happen with water. In Spain, we don't have any of these great challenges for accessing water. People have access to sanitation systems, but we're not working on replacing assets. We're not investing in changing networks, on reclamation capacities. We have desalination facilities in the coast of the Mediterranean that up until the last drought were operating to 1/5 of their installed capacity. And this is not because engineers don't know how to operate these plants, but because we couldn't find the demand. We hadn't been able to redesign the incentive system and thus allow this to work to a full force. In 2019, Spain received 89 million tourists for a country of 46 million. 89 million tourists. So it's a 2nd or 3rd country in the world in terms of tourism. And someone would say, well, did we have any water supply issues? No. And they all concentrated in May and September. And to this, we need to add 100 million trips between July and August. That was not the challenge. But what about wastewater treatment? Spain is paying penalties all the time for non-compliance for 2 decades of the European Directive on urban wastewater treatment. Well, I think that we are okay with the debate, with the discussion. I don't know if there are any questions. Not a few. We have many questions. Let's see if we have time before the second part of the discussion. You've answered already the one within your presentations, but I will go little by little. I will start with Carlos. You mentioned the lack of consistency between the real cost of water and the production cost. Why is there this gap, and is there a need for more training in the area to cover this gap. Yes, we kind of dealt with that issue, but there is a great distance between the cost and what we're willing to pay. And that happens not only in water, not only happens in water. No one questions paying for their mobile phone every month or the data package every month. And people know that if they don't have access to Wi-Fi, they'll use their data and they're willing to pay for it. But with water, that's not the case. Today, the cost of water is not associated with the right concept. Are you paying for the security, certainty of opening a tap and having water? You're not paying for that. And there are other systems that are quite complex, as the ones my colleague mentioned. You have the right to use a water resource for just 10 cents, and they use that to irrigate their crops. And no one asks, why do you pay 10 cents? And why someone in Madrid or in another industry doesn't have that right? It's completely off-balanced. But no one can adjust that equation. And then the third factor is that we're not used to put in the costs of water. But once we know the total cost, I could, for example, apply some subsidies or adjust the rate, the fee. But first, the exercise, the attempt that we need to do is study the real cost of water. We need to structure the price that should go within the fee. And Algeria, for example, decided that 80% of citizens who lived in the coast, they are not going to pay for any water service. They will be funded by another company that is willing to do so, but water was guaranteed. So there are many schemes, but the work that hasn't been done yet, honestly, is cost, the opportunity cost, the security cost, the transport cost. And whenever you have a cost, and people realize that, people will know what they have to pay. And then, unless you know what something costs, you don't know what you're paying for. And whatever you pay for water can be adjusted, be increased or decreased depending on the circumstances. It is a very complex phenomenon, but the countries that are doing it are having great success. Maybe if we said that public healthcare has this cost and it's not for free, maybe if we were aware of that, we would react differently. In what area should we improve to develop PPP projects? Thank you. Private-public participation. Well, in principle, there are certain risks that the private sector cannot mitigate. You put the Algerian example. It is clear that transferring the cost of the bill of a person who in Honain opened the taps and consumes water was not a feasible alternative for an outside operator. So there are a number of risks that cannot be borne by the private sector because they don't have the capacity to manage them. And this, in the case of water, is quite clear. So I think that most public policies should be aimed at long-term availability, not transferring the risk of a distribution, because these networks connect when there's a low emission. This is something that you cannot bear on the private companies, availability of land and programs that guarantee operators the availability and possibility to exploit their areas without having the rules of the game changed. This has all been analyzed, and there are many examples in the world of projects that have been quite successful. But the Spanish case has been a disaster. The 3 desalination plants, their operations are funded by public funds, and no one realized that what we needed to do is that we needed to change the incentive system. So there are many, many examples. And I think that in the case of water, we are working from scratch. We're like in the 70s. In the 70s, no one knew how much a light bulb, switching on a light bulb costs, but now we know. And there's another question about investment in R&D. But when you compare that to the pharmaceutical sector, that was very clear. So I'll go to the next question to Gonzalo. Why do you think Madrid will play a key role when promoting responsible and sustainable investment in between the EU, Latin America, and other regions in the world? Well, basically because it has a natural position, not just from our geographical point of view, but also because of the cultural, economic, and linguistic links. Spain has always been a hub, an access hub for Europe. Spain, with its mistakes and its good practices, has been a benchmark for many, many countries, and it has been so for 100 years ago, prior to our regional governments. And this has prevented us from many territorial conflicts, because in the countries where this doesn't happen, that the regional government was defined before the Basin Authority, and we have the example of Peru. And also, we have this link with the northern region of Africa. So I think there are certain features about Madrid that make it natural hub, we could say, to find this connection, this link between the EU, Latin America, and the northern Africa, or even beyond that, because I think Europe needs to make an effort to better understand Asia. I think that Europe, we will end up being a privileged minority in the planet. We would need to be able to better understand our relations with Asia, where we have seen great progress. We still have a rather archaic vision of China. We say China has great pollution problems and degradation problems. Well, this is true, but they are at the forefront of other innovations. Singapore, for example, Singapore is a city-state with very peculiar characteristics. We don't need to probably make all our water safe for drinking, but maybe we could learn from them how to channel the technological investments. So these are all characteristics that make us think that Spain and Madrid within Spain could have certain dynamic effect to act as a catalyzer. There is one question, but I don't want to leave our audience, out our audience. So I don't know if anyone here wants to raise a question. Otherwise, I'll give the floor to the next question. So the last question that I have here in the chat is for Fernando again. What are the main barriers that you've seen in the countries where you've worked to successfully develop infrastructure projects under the project finance scheme? Well, with regards to water, we have a great variety of options, and in all of them, thanks to the political will that I mentioned before, we were able to overcome these obstacles. And these include all types of risks. For example, the exchange rate. Maybe you build a plant and you pay in euro and dollars, and they're going to pay for you in a currency that cannot be exchanged, and a currency that risks fluctuations. The official exchange rate for the regular exchange rate. And in some jurisdictions, you get the contract that says the contract that a person in his or her house signs for the service, and this is for a desalination or for an industrial plant. No, you need to guarantee a number of requirements. Also, the lands, the public lands. I'm going to develop a public project with I need a certain availability. You need to mitigate risks. You need to let me know. You need to guarantee that this public land belongs to this or that person, and there won't be any expropriation problems later because there are some property rights that come from the times of the colonies. No, we cannot do that. Permits. We need, we interact with several sectors, and they all need specific certification. And all of this is an index that is very clear, and it's been thoroughly analyzed. And you realize that when there's political will, the moment the problem appears, the solution comes. And sometimes, if the methodology and the regulation, from the regulatory perspective, it's a complex project, with political will, problems can be solved. And no one can think that the private operator doesn't bear any risks. These are safe businesses. No, I remember the first plants in Algeria in 2003, and the country had just ended a war in the year 2000. So there weren't so many companies willing to invest in a country that had just finished the war. These investors decided to undertake these risks from many perspectives, environmental, economical, but with the right technology. So we need to share the burden of the risks between the public and private sector. And the public sector needs to enter into the risks that cannot be managed by the private sector. And I think that this has been already, it's already there, it's already available, but we just need the political will to take part. The keys to your answer, Fernando, is guarantees and security in the long term. Yes, if someone comes to invest for 25 years and they're going to spend lots of money on a specific infrastructure, this person needs to know that the rules of engagement won't change. And in that game, this investor is willing to undertake some risks, and the other party should be able to and should be willing to undertake those risks. But this needs to be in the long term. But if in 5 years they tell me that now I need another document, but now there's the ministry now says that there's another paper that they need, and they stop operation, no one as an investor or advisor will go for that. And you complicate this even further, where you have administrations that change, because 25 years mean that you will be working with several administrations. Well, if anyone from the no one from the audience has a question, and I don't have any other questions from the platform, I don't know if you want to start with the second part of your discussion. Luis and Aziza, that will be connecting shortly. She will be connecting through an online signal. This topic of water is so interesting. Sometimes we just don't think about it. We just give it take it for granted. We're not connecting with Aziza. I don't know if you want to start up until she connects. There's no problem with that. Well, there she is. We have 40 minutes for the second part of the debates. Indeed, 40 minutes. So please, you need to be aware of the time. No, I think we're behaving properly. Gonzalo, I don't know if you could introduce Aziza, and we thank you for your time. So should we start with her? So we have Aziza. I know she's a key person in the international community, not only in the terms of water. She has a PhD from the Sorbonne University, and she has been not only a key person in the water governance the program of the OECD and the creation of the Policy Forum on Water worldwide, which is the most important one, the Water Governance Initiative of the OECD, but she was also the founder, the heart of that process, and right now she has such an important position that I'm not going to be able to remember it, but she's head of division of OECD Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, based in Paris. She's a star. We have the honor to have her here. She's a spectacular speaker. Today we've asked her to speak in Spanish, but she speaks many languages, and she will speak in Spanish. So, Aziza, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much for your kind words and for putting on the pressure on me, because I need to live up to these expectations. I'd like to thank you for the invite. Unfortunately, it has to be virtual. I would have liked to join you in Madrid, but when Gonzalo contacted me for this seminar on the topic of water, the idea of how the pandemic has affected issues related to water is an interesting topic. I'd like to talk not about water proper, but about territorial policy. We always complain and say that water policy hasn't been developed enough. Now there are other industries like solid residues or transportation, areas in which governance has been progressing much more. When we started to look into the impact of this crisis at the level of local government in the supply of basic services, obviously water has been a recurring topic, as in other health crises, like, for example, the cholera pandemic in the 19th century, even that has had an accelerating effect. Part of our well-being depends on the access to local services, always against the backdrop of climate change and the management of resources. We need to bear in mind other salient trends that have to do with water resources in the medium and long term. We have, for example, the population pressure and migration flows, but also the aging of the population that is now a major challenge for the infrastructure of OECD countries, and also against the backdrop of the provision and supply of basic issues like the water. Looking at new paradigms that come up and accelerate with the COVID-19 pandemic, that will have an impact on how policy is dealt with, more specifically in the field of water. I can see three trends in our analysis of about 100 cities in the OECD that have started their recovery strategies, looking into the situation in their various cities. One is related to feasibility. Citizens should be able to live where they want to live, in a city where you have all sorts of conveniences, and that is the city of your choice, instead of being stuck with a city where you have to be because that's where your job is, for example. So there is an element of need. Furthermore, there is a trend towards a more polycentric dimension. That is, not only the big city areas, but also smaller cities and medium-large cities. Accessibility. Surely you have heard the speeches about the so-called 15-minute cities like Paris, or 10-minute cities like Brussels, or half-an-hour territories. That is another term that is often mentioned. These are types of urbanization that increase the costs for the citizens, and we should rethink the supply of basic services in a 2-kilometer area around where somebody lives. That should provide access to a job, to health services, to schooling, and to leisure, for example. So in many cases, people are rethinking the concept of time. And speaking about your job, for example, not everyone can work remotely, but why do we absolutely necessarily have to go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning? Everyone clogging public transport and road arteries. We can really rethink, reshape our activities in the cities. And this is going to have a major impact and reduce the consumption of natural resources, reduce the impact on them. So in 1 year, we have learned what else otherwise have taken us a whole century. And this also helps us reduce the pressure on natural resources. Now the trend goes towards decompacting the cities. And many industries are realizing this. Then there is another issue: environmental awareness. In many countries we work with in the OECD, they felt the greater effect that already was there before the COVID-19 pandemic. The Zoom effect. People realized in a way that they could still work and without having to take a daily flight or without having to commute to the office. That is this dimension: short circuits, circular economy, short travel times, and solutions that are more geared towards nature in the cities. In the field of water, we've been doing this for about a decade. And now, this is much more acceptable to the mayors, for example, than years ago. Tactical urbanization, for example. I hope this trend is going to bear fruit in many metropolitan areas where we are working and where we are operational. And water has an important role to play because up to now, water has been very important in these attempts at circular economy. For example, the city of Granada, we have realized that in the field of water, this transition towards a circular economy has been boosted and driven ahead. Furthermore, and after listening to you, and in closing, let's talk about funding and the effect of funding for the sector. Productivity and well-being cannot only be thought in terms of the big metropolitan areas and then, on the other hand, the rest of the world that is rural. I do think that thanks to the crisis, people have realized that we need to look for a better balance in terms of well-being, and that there is potential that is still unused in the so-called medium-large cities, the ones that are close to the huge urban areas, these medium cities that are still interesting in terms of access to basic services or to jobs, but at a lesser cost than the one we face in bigger cities, like lack of safety or pollution, for example. So these medium-large cities will emerge because they are very handy, very helpful when we deal with the proper management of our resources. So it's a matter of scale, it's an issue of size, and these smaller, medium, large cities are more attractive. And more specifically, dealing with water, we need to become more transverse, more multi-sectoral in cities in France like Angers, for example, or recently in Dijon with service supplier like Suez that include their investments within an smart city strategy that transcends the mere water management policy. And so, in closing, in order to be able to start a debate, citizens are going to have an increasing impact on the policy, and the water industry needs to transcend this territorial magnitude that is the city. Thank you, Aziza. After listening to Luis, we'll have a debate. Can you hear us? Yes, so I was just thanking you and saying that after listening to Luis, there'll be a debate. Surely there'll be a question for you, or questions. So if you stay with us, we'll be very grateful. Luis. Oh, thank you so much, Luis. Luis is an aeronautical engineer with a track record of more than 30 years. He started in the aeronautical and technological industry, but about 2/3 of your curriculum dealt with renewables, and more specifically with the world of hydrogen. I'm sure that hydrogen is going to be truly disruptive. Thinking about sustainability, hydrogen comes to mind. Obviously, you need to invest, you need to develop, funding is needed, but you, Luis, can give us your take against the backdrop of Origin, your company. Yeah, we wanted to talk about new entrants. I love what Aziza has said about this new sustainability. But we talk about sustainability. At the end of the day, we always tread water, and it's always about renewables. Surely there's more to this. So I've always advocated the renewable energies because I knew that water goes hand in hand with them. Many people are fairly ignorant of what hydrogen is, especially green hydrogen. So can you please elaborate on that? Of course. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, the City of Madrid, that has provided this platform. So thank you for having me. I do absolutely agree with what you said, that sustainability has to be redefined as an integral part of a larger vision that encompasses also water. I'd like to strike a little more optimistic note. The pandemic has showcased to what extent health is important, more than ever, and health goes hand in hand with water, necessarily so. So, as Fernando said, it's a easy issue, but also a complex issue, because we also have to externalize the costs. The end user needs to know the true worth and cost of what he or she consumes. So let me try and provide an answer. Well, hydrogen hasn't been invented yesterday. This is a natural resource that has existed forever, and there are huge quantities available, but you need to create it through H2O with two components of water. When we produce hydrogen, depending on the energy sources, there'll be a color attached to it. Traditionally, hydrogen has been produced with fossil fuel sources, coal, mainly, or fuel oil or diesel, and this would be the traditional or gray hydrogen. Now, as an evolution, we have a new component of fossil fuels that is more environmentally friendly, natural gas, and that would be blue hydrogen. And finally, there's a green component. I would like to be more specific. I'd like to say renewable. That is, when, in order to produce hydrogen, we use renewables. PV, wind, biogas, whatever. At the end of the day, an electric source of energy that has no greenhouse gas emissions as a consequence. So 95 to 97% of global hydrogen production today is polluting, is produced with non-renewables. So there's one big challenge for all of us. At some point in time, we will be talking about renewable water, but we already talk about renewable hydrogen. Hydrogen is an excellent energy vector for different industries, as we will see later on, but we need to produce it with renewables. And that's it. So, why does hydrogen live such a heyday right now as a disruptive element? What is the explanation? Well, I would say there are 3 bullet points here. But most importantly, the fact is that our society is becoming ever more electricity dependent. Electricity is all-pervading, mainly in the industrialized countries, and the rest of the countries will be following suit as and when. But electricity as an energy does not reach all the applications that society needs. So electrification is either non-competitive or not really feasible for heavy transport or for industrial heat generation. These are two massive energy demands in terms of electricity, and here hydrogen is going to be a winning bet. And that is so because in the last, let's say, 20 years, in society, we've been able to reduce the costs of kilowatt hours with renewables, either solar or wind, renewables as a whole. But in every operation and every bid in Latin America, in Middle East, or in Europe, we're talking more and more about the cost of renewables that are competitive and that to date, before were unthinkable, unimaginable. Really, I would have never have thought of these costs. So we do have very competitive costing and the possibility of creating a competitive solution for energy generation, for industrial heating, and heavy transport, and that is really a winning bet. Then, furthermore, moving on to renewables, we know about the intermittency. That's a fact of life. When there is sun, there is a peak production. No sun, we have a problem. And the same can be said about wind as an energy source. But the demand is constant 24/7. So we do need a low-cost industrial storage solution. The industrial and technological solution that will allow us to efficiently manage these demands in ever more competitive terms is going to be provided by green hydrogen.
Combination of storage and solution in the short and medium term to heavy transport plus industrial heating is what this renewable hydrogen advantages. Aziza, if you want to make or add another comment. So, aside from your comment and from our opinion, one of the main problems in the water sector is 24/7 availability. So up until we the either solar or wind energy plants give us energy at a competitive price, that will be one of the challenges ahead. The next step, when you break continuity and when you achieve continuity and you have competitive prices, we enter into the regulatory issue. What would you underline of the current regulatory framework? Well, that's an excellent question because I've personally suffered what the regulatory change is from a retroactive perspective. I am an engineer, but lawyers have mentioned a new concept that is retroactivity, and this has meant that I've lost money. So whatever we regulate, we need to maintain this in time. This regulatory certitude that perhaps is something that Fernando mentioned, and that is something that he knows very well because he's a specialist in law. What we would like is for you not to change the rules of engagement in the middle of a match. This is something that anyone would understand. I'm sure the political class is no exception. So the revolution of hydrogen is strongly linked to regulation of the chemical industry, the gas industry, and oil industry. The regulation that exists today did not contemplate renewable hydrogen or electric regulation, the so-called special scheme in the world of energy the fossil fuels will be the special ones, and the renewables will become the new normal. Currently, we know that there are sufficient studies from think tanks that say that we can increase up until over 20% the level of availability without great investments in technology or costs. So if we really want to develop renewable hydrogen quickly, so regulation and legislation should go hand in hand. And Carlos, you mentioned before a little bit what you are seeing or what you're suffering in the water sector. So here we would like to request public administrations to, and I'm going to say perfect, but reasonably well. We want this regulation that was enacted for the renewables to be used as well for hydrogen. If regulation walks with us, this will accelerate things, but if the other way around, it will make things slower. But we have at least 17 regulations on that. I wanted to raise a question about something that you mentioned before, the retroactivity and the causes and effects of this retroactivity. If currently we need incentives within the deployment of green hydrogen. Well, as it usually happens with disruptive technologies, and it is important to understand that it's not just the production of hydrogen, but the distribution, the logistics, the marketing, and everything that goes with that. For example, all the devices that go hand in hand with the use of hydrogen. Of course, we need incentives, and this is something that we need in 2/3 of the world, and 2/3 of the world with traditional sources of energy. We still subsidize diesel and fossil fuels in an important part of the world. And so the renewable hydrogen sector in the very, very short term, and this is defined to no more than 5 years from now, will need fiscal support or ease of funding, because the figures right now are not good. And just to give you an idea, to be able to transfer the cost of hydrogen to the price of diesel, we would need to increase it by 4 or 5 euros. So we need an incentivizing intensity of 20–30%. I would like to remember, if you don't know a lot about this, when we started with the renewables incentive, they started with 700% incentives. Someone could think why someone would do that. Why would anyone do that? Well, the result is that now we have a great amount of renewable technologies that are very, very competitive. It's true that we have investment. We have invested hugely, but this is a result. We have incentivized demand to use a certain type of energy. This developed technology exponentially, and this learning curve has made that not even in my wildest dreams I would have imagined that we would have reached the levels that we have reached right now. So this capacity to incentivize in the future won't be necessary. So the pathway is quite short. And I would even dare to say that seeing the learning curves that we see in the renewable sector, any of the technologies, not just, and I'm insisting, not the generating aspect, but in the whole value chain to produce green hydrogen, if we use scale economies and learning speeds of around 20% or 25%, I would dare to say that, as I said before, this incentive won't be needed for more than 5 years. Since I know we still have 10–15 minutes, tops, I would like to raise some questions because I would like to have the vision of the two parts, of the two parties here. Because renewable energies are definitely a success case, but the footprint in the EU is not so positive. Would you say that this will happen with green hydrogen? Would you say that we will face the same issue? Luis, if you want to start, and then we'll listen to Asisa's vision. Well, I will talk from my personal experience. I've been privileged enough to open solar cells and solar panel industries in Spain, in France, in Germany. And sadly, I've had to close some of them. So I've lived firsthand this delocalization, which is completely lawful, I must say. Competition wins. I mean, that's a market. And I think that there's been an incentive by European citizens that has not translated into the generation of an industry. And this is a fact, completely objective. And I'm not saying that because the renewable industry is now delocalized in Asia, this happened. But I think that what I call the renewable hydrogen industry, I don't think that delocalization will be as easy. And that's because the circular economy developed through a network of, let's say, the generator plant of the hydrogen and the infrastructure ecosystem and logistics that you need is not as easily transferable. If we want that, we need to build these new ecosystems in the country that is interested. So there are more sophisticated fabrics, and this makes it the economy of green hydrogen is in a better position than renewables. Do you have an opinion on that? Asisa, do you think so? Do you see it differently? Well, some ideas. I don't know what the future of hydrogen will be, but I do know is that analyzing the recovery strategies in the post-COVID-19 era of the OECD countries, we see a number of countries that are paying lots of attention to this sector and the opportunities of hydrogen. And we see this in France, for example, in Korea, in the Netherlands. And here, it is important to say that this development will have a territorial dimension that will be quite significant. And local governments will also have a role to play. And this is the change that we see with when we compare it to renewable energies a decade ago, where the rural dimension of the renewables was emphasized greatly, but not so much the potential for the cities the way they are. And since we know that cities consume 2/3 of energy, even if there's a strong dimension at a national level, that balance had not been reached in that time. What is certain is that in the data that we produce to territorialize the SDGs and measure the distance, that 600 cities from 250,000 inhabitants of the OECD countries, for each of the 17 SDGs, not just SDG 11, we see that the SDG that has to do with access to clean energy is where we see that the distance to be traveled to achieve the target for 2030 is the longest. 80% of the cities of OECD countries are not en route to meet the target. And this raises reflection on institutionality and on shared responsibility to achieve this ecological transition. We still see many countries that design roadmaps or action plans or initiatives from the capitals, thinking that they will be implemented magically. And that's not the case when we see public investment or public expenditure towards environmental sectors or areas that are related to the climate. 74 until 54% have a subnational level. These are regions or citizens. So until we change our mindset with regard to ecological transition and this shared responsibility and territorialize many of these deployment strategies, all the recovery plans designed by governments won't be materialized, and they won't have the acceptance that they require, because the reluctance that we saw on the renewables, for example, came from a lack of awareness and involvement of the stakeholders. So it's not just the funding, but also governance and engagement and involvement of the citizens. So there is an interest. I think that there is a level of maturity in the co-design of environmental policies in many OECD countries, but this requires territorializing these reflections to reap the benefits that are expected. Yes, I would like to add on what Aziza is saying. In one of my first interventions, they were saying that one of the main conclusions we should draw from this pandemic is not think that we can solve a pandemic locally when this is a global problem. And this has to do with sustainability and availability of services, because we tend to think that since public services are served locally, they're a local reality. But that's not the case. What we're talking about today has a dimension that goes beyond local, even if it has a local dimension. And there was something that Aziza mentioned in her first presentation. We've talked about regulatory uncertainty, about stable rules of engagement. But if we go into the public policy, one thing that we've discovered is that countries increase their predictability are also more stable. If we're talking about global challenges, a notion of globalization that has to do with the SDGs and with many other factors, we cannot isolate anything from the SDGs. And if we see this as a whole and we recognize the complexity of this issue, then we would need to accept that in practice this discussion that needs to be extracted from politics as 4-year terms, and understand that ecological transition is something that we won't be able to undertake unless there is a stable roadmap that should work regardless of the government. We can incorporate nuances, but the discussion on sustainable urban development or water security is not a discussion that is absent from national politics. Should be included as a whole. I don't know if you agree with this, Aziza. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, just to add an anecdote that is quite revealing, we have a network of 50 mayors with whom we work on inequality issues. And when we talk to them about the SDGs, they all say the Sustainable Development Goal and the 2030 Agenda. They say, I don't wake up in the morning with the goal of implementing the SDGs, but with the goal of solving very specific issues that are behind each of the SDGs, like provide water and sanitation, ensure access to energy, creating jobs, etc. And it is very interesting to see the way in which Many of them have used the 2030 agenda as a means for an end, a way to think about planning locally, the way in which they allocate budget, in which they prioritize investment, with achieving the SDGs, and not using the SDGs as a monitoring tool, because in fact the national governments were the ones that committed to adhere to this commitment. It's the national government that go every year and say where they are. But we see that this agenda is being used as a tool for public policy and to solve some of the issues that appear, because we do know that if we have a siloed approach, in the SDGs, they will go against progress in other SDGs. So we need a holistic approach, and thus we need to think differently in terms of how to allocate budgets. And I think there are increasingly more cities that are on that pathway. We have COVID restrictions that are quite firm. I don't know if we have time for our last question. We just have a last question, and I'm really sorry because I was so interested about your talk. Well, let's see if we can answer this question very quickly. I think this is for you, Luis, because it talks about hydrogen. It's not competitive for heavy transport. You said that in the long term it is, but could it be competitive for maritime transport? The answer is absolutely yes. The thing that I want to say is for heavy road transport, competitiveness is quite close. We will just need a few years, but for maritime transport, we will need more time. So it will be the other way around. Indeed, yeah. Okay, so there were some questions left, but we give you the choice to close this panel, Asisa, and we would like to thank you both for your presence. It's been very, very interesting. I know that if we had more than 2 hours, we would still be here. Well, I will stop here. I don't have anything to add, but I just want to thank you all for the opportunity, and I hope that we have another occasion to bring together the lessons learned in urban development and water policies, because I think there are many synergies between the two worlds. If you come to Madrid, here we are. We will be happy to have you. Thank you very much. Thank you.